Bringan.
Oscar Corla, and I'm happy to be speaking today on what I believe should be an important issue for Ireland and for the future of our democracy. And it's very interesting to hear all the debate today in relation to the abolition of the Seanad, and all that people can seem to see is the Seanad as it exists now. And I think that is what is wrong with this bill. We should be talking about reform. Because while I believe that the Seanad is far from perfect, a reformed one is much preferable than none at all. I believe the Seanad should remain, and if the people decide to keep the Seanad, then its reform should begin immediately, because I do agree that it is unviable as it exists today. Firstly, I would like to thank Senators Catherine Zappone and Fergal Quinn in particular for making a solid argument for the reform of the Seanad as opposed to its abolition. And also my technical group colleague Shane Ross for his valuable contribution to the debate and the publishing of his bill on reform. I would also like to acknowledge government deputies and senators who have stepped away from the party line and have voiced their concerns, and I hope they continue to do so and will do so on many other issues which might make our democracy more relevant for people. I am of the belief that the Seanad as it stands is little more than a talking shop for people who are not directly elected. The fact is that successive governments, and particularly Fianna Fáil, have failed for decades to address the problems that have existed in the House. There have been 11 reports in total, but all have been left on the shelf to gather dust. But inaction does not justify its abolition. Radical reform is what is needed. Firstly, I think there is merit in much of the contents of the 2004 subcommittee report on Seanad reform, which I believe should be re-examined in the event that the Seanad referendum doesn't pass. That most senators be directly elected and giving them the responsibility to review government policy, scrutinise senior public appointments and assess EU legislative proposals would in itself be a dramatic reform. And I think what could go a long way to reforming the Seanad would be the abolition of the Taoiseach's nominees, because I think anything that guarantees a government majority in the Seanad makes sure that it will be ineffective. I believe the Seanad could play a key role in European affairs, and we have to date as a nation failed to fully engage with the European legislative process and realise the enhanced role of the Oireachtas regarding European affairs through the ratification of the Lisbon Treaty, leaving much of what goes on in this area unscrutinised, and that is a threat to the quality of our democracy, where a reformed Seanad could be of value. And what is needed is a reformed Seanad that is made more democratic and more effective. To have all senators directly elected would require another constitutional amendment. However, there is scope for the radical expansion of the Seanad electorate that would still include universal franchise while maintaining the panel system. This is something which is dealt with in more detail in the consultation by the senators that I mentioned earlier, and I think it is something that should be considered. This bill proposes to transfer duties to the Dáil, and what this government calls reform of the Dáil. But it does nothing to reduce the powers of the executive, and quite worryingly, we know very little about the small print of any of these changes. When will these so-called reforms take place and how? There is no transparency, there has been no consultation with the opposition, and we will see through this legislation the continuous rule of the executive over the Dáil. Independent TDs will lose out on opportunities in committees, and as it stands, technical group TDs can't challenge the order of business, despite it being raised on numerous occasions with the government and with the whips. There's a continuous refusal to allow that to happen.
1 minute remaining.
And thank you. And independent DDs have no amendment or legislative support, despite the fact that we make up 1/3 of the opposition. And the support is given to Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin to enable them to carry out their legislative duties. But this government continuously refuses to allow that to happen for independent TDs. Other countries of a similar size that have a unicameral system have more accountability and transparency. And much has been said about Sweden, Denmark, Finland. You could list a long list of countries. They have strong regional and municipal assemblies, and they have considerable authority and responsibility. But yet this government, in terms of reform, is reducing democratic accountability at a local level by abolishing town councils and making electoral areas bigger and more difficult for county councillors. So we don't talk about the Finland or Sweden or Denmark and how they only have a unicameral system when you continue to not give powers to local government and ensure that local government can develop. And if I hear another comment in here about Manchester and how we're only the size of Manchester, I think I'll puke on the floor, because I think that's the most ridiculous argument I've ever heard any politician put forward, and unfortunately it comes from the government side all the time. Manchester is an area within a country of 60 million people that has a huge economy and a powerful economy. It cannot be compared to a country like ours. When you want to compare us to something, why not look at Finland, look at Norway, look at Denmark, look at Sweden, those countries of a comparable size that have a far more developed economy, far more developed democracy, and far more accountability and transparency than this government would like to see in this House.
Thank you, Deputy.
I think we're in an area of cutting costs, and in theory I don't object to that, but this government continues to cut in areas that are detrimental to society. The abolition of the Seanad, I believe, would be detrimental as well, reducing transparency and democracy, and I object to its abolition in the strongest terms. How our political system works affects us all, and I am concerned that some will vote in favour of abolition as a cost-saving measure without understanding its true worth to democracy. But we, I believe, should make it accountable and should make it a democratic institution, and we should be debating reform, not abolition.